Christina. Thank you
Hello there.
for joining us on Still Searching, my new endeavor here. So, just introduce yourself to everyone. Tell us who you are and what you do.
All right. So I am Dr. Christina Lane. I am a criminologist, and my area of study in general, it would be deviance. So that means that I am not defined by what law dictates as a crime. I also enjoy studying why people deviate from the norm and do things that are abnormal, in particular when they harm themselves or harm others. I am currently right now at Russell Sage College. I am an associate professor of practice, and I am also the director of the Criminal Investigation Resource Center.
Great work that you're doing there. But let's talk a little bit about what led you to there. I know before we sat down, you said it's going to take us a while, but let's start, where did you start, Tina?
Okay. So that's quite the long story in a sense. I don't know how far back you want me to go. I did a lot of trying things out and then going back to school. I did not initially think that I would become a criminologist, especially focused in deviance, as Dr. Chris Kunkel and I work on. I would never think that or we would actually establish a center with a successful program to be utilized as a tool by police agencies. So in the beginning, or let's go back to Canada.
Yes, let's go back.
Yeah, let's go back. So University of Alberta is where I got my undergraduate degree, and it was initially psychology, but through internships I realized through psychology, and it was actually, I interned at Alberta Hospital Edmonton. It was a very large campus-like place for people suffering from mental illness. And when I went there, I thought, okay, I want to be a psychologist. This is what I want to do. But I found out that psychologists in those settings don't really engage in much treatment from my internship experience. It's usually the psychiatrist that works with the patients because they're the ones who actually can
prescribe.
Exactly, you got it. I decided that's not the thing I want to do. But then over at University of Alberta, way back then, okay, they had a program in criminology. Okay, so it was sociology masters. So then I said, well, okay, I'll do the master's program. But in between, I thought I wanted to be a school teacher.
Well, makes sense now.
Yeah, go figure, right? I'm teaching, right?
Yeah.
But yet the topic matter is very different from what you teach
yes.
elementary kids, right?
I would hope so.
Or in high school. So I, and also I interned in many places, and then I realized, okay, I want to go into this, so you just follow your nose. I'm doing well in this, so I got accepted in their graduate program, and a graduate specialization in criminology, and specifically, more sociology or just social structure, But I did have an undergraduate in psychology,
right.
So I'm very interdisciplinary in my training. And I focused on comparing how minority groups conflict in an area of society and living in disadvantaged areas, how that makes things more prone for social problems, and therefore crime is a byproduct of that. And I compared the groups of First Nations up in Canada with minorities, African Americans, down in the United States. And they share a lot of similarities in a sense. It's more of disadvantaged people, not by groups themselves, but living in disadvantaged areas, not having opportunity. Then I moved on and I applied to SUNY Albany, which back then was the leading graduate program in criminal justice for my PhD. Now, along that route, I ended up getting another master's, just for giggles,
just
right?
For the fun of it.
Well, there we go, got another one.
And
it's in criminal justice. Okay, even though my area is criminology,
so all the things intertwined.
Exactly, but at the end, I got my PhD, and my PhD is nature of crime or criminal behavior. And I also had another specialty of planned change, as they called it. So what do you do in changing communities or individuals to kind of rehabilitate or develop a community? So I graduated. My study was on the impact. I still continue with focusing on First Nations. And I study the impact of environmental crime by corporations and how it impacted the community of the Akwesasne Mohawk. And I studied and utilized the psychological causal diagram of Lazarus, who talks about stress and how stress and emotion impacts the decisions, and how even if something like pollution, you can't see it, it actually increases the stress level of victims and impacts them even more. Yes, it is. It surrounds you, and it was horrible, and it's still horrible because we're talking about long term. And the Aquasasna community was wonderful to work with, and the people coming forward to talk about how it impacted them. And I do someday would love to give back with the Criminal Investigation Research Center to assist them, if wanted, to address those issues that they're experiencing about First Nation youth and their disappearances, and also homicide. But back to the area of my research, I talked to and interviewed over 100 people, and it did find clearly that there is an impact. Some of the people would talk, they'd be driving over the bridge into Canada, and the big plume of smoke would come down and drift down over the cars. Then they had problems with their cattle. Fluoride would come in the air, and then what the pollution does is that it would fall out in the air into the grass, and the cows would eat the grass, and they would suffer something called fluorosis. Everything's poisoned. It was, the water, the air, the ground, everything you grow on. And then the community has to adapt, and they bring the casinos in, and then you get other people from the community coming in, which no longer have traditional ways, and then you have a loss of a group of people in a way of life. But back to the fluorosis with the cows, it's a horrible experience. Your fluoride in toothpaste is to make your teeth stronger, right? Too much fluoride will make your teeth brittle. And what happened is the cows, their bones would slowly get brittle and break in the weight. It's a horrible disease. Well, long-term consequences, it happened to humans too. They're people, they're the same elements. Their hands would be all curled from the fluorosis. And there was no direct connection that you can make that plausible because of long-term outcomes. And the thing is, it's invisible. You don't see it, and, this has gone a different direction from what we're talking about with CERC. But, it is an important issue about the impact of pollution, and to be aware of it can actually have negative psychological impact on a person and how you can deal with it. Look, that was my dissertation, right?
So in other words, she's smart.
Yeah, no. But thank you.
That really speaks to, like you said, all the interdisciplinary training that you have.
Yes.
Really makes for a well-rounded, person to run CERC.
Yeah, and the one thing is, it's nice, criminologists, people don't understand this, but we are specialists. Like Dr. Chris Kunkel, he specializes in the psychology. So if you want him to assess personality and that, and he has the clinical background to assess that. But criminologists, we come in and we're jack of all trades, master of nothing. So, and that's what we are. We can switch gears and discipline and explain why criminality occurs. So, this is why Chris and I work so well together, is I am kind of like the macro, the big picture, in everything. And then Chris comes in. He can focus on certain elements of the crime, because when you talk about a crime, it is a larger discipline, multidiscipline problem. It's not just one. And I think if you just have one discipline, have ownership, and say, we know best, you really miss a lot of information that is impacting the event that happens.
Well, I think that's something that's shown today when you watch some of these true crime documentaries or things that are on Netflix, or some of the big names, that they show the whole picture. They show from childhood up to crime, and sometimes even afterwards, speaking to them behind bars or to family members after their death, or whatever the case is. But they follow the whole timeline, because those little pieces sometimes are so important, like the abuse as a child, or abandonment, or you name it. All these things are piling up to this big event, or multiple big events, or this behavior like you were talking about. They just it's like the perfect storm. So you need to understand those prior things in order to understand the big picture.
Definitely. And the downside, though, with the elements that you talk about, the life course development picture, and you look at all these people, like if you do a study for everybody who's in prison, most of them have been abused. But then you look at everyone who's been abused or who has been abused.
Not all of them are in prison.
Not well. But are they doing bad things still?
I
don't know.
Right.
But the thing is that they turned out to be fine.
Right.
They were able to cope with adversity.
Yeah.
I have this one scenario. I remember I used to work at a shoe store.
So you've done it all.
Yeah. The one person I worked with, and I was very young, and I still remember he said that him and his wife made the decision not to have children because he came from a large family and was severely physically abused. But I find it so sad. A person who made such a decision would probably be the person less likely to do that. So people run with that. Oh, this happened to me, therefore I'm going to perpetuate the cycle.
Yeah.
And not only that, in academic research, no one knows what pushes that person to commit crime or to harm other people. There's many explanations, that you can pull out the air, that they can't handle the emotions, or they keep fantasizing over and over again, and then you have to do it. The way when I teach my class, it's like you start your day out like, oh, I really want pizza, but I shouldn't. I'm on diet, right? And then all of a sudden, you
end up eating the pizza.
You're like, hey, honey, I'm buying pizza tonight. But it's like, or it goes on for a week, right? Mm-hmm. So you start thinking, and it kind of pushes you. Now, of course, having pizza is not the taboo of killing someone.
Very different, right?
But it's the same kind of thought process, But what makes some people get pizza and other people not, right? Or we can also take the larger jump with pornography, right? So why do people watch coercive pornography but never practice it in the bedroom? But then you look at other people that get caught doing these horrible deviant acts to other people, and their house is full of toys and coercive pornography and that. The big question is, what pushes these people?
Tipping point?
That's the tipping point. The tipping point usually comes into play when the person is so fully absorbed into their deviance and fantasy that finally something just pushes them to start, or something starts to embolden them, or they start doing a little test. Like, I don't know, people overlook when cats, usually I hear it's cats, dogs, animals that are tortured, and sometimes you find them along a river. Some of them you hear of cats being nailed to trees. That's really experimentation. The question is, are they going to go to the next phase? What's going to motivate them to panic? Like the one thing, let's talk about, many people know who Jeffrey Dahmer is, right? Jeffrey Dahmer used to masturbate to roadkill, and
strange.
Yes, it is. Well, lots of strange stuff, but he kept it quiet, right? And he would experiment.
Able to operate for so long without.
But he's the one individual that kind of fought trying to kill. Mm-hmm. When he dismembered the bodies, he would drink, where other killers would not drink, and I would tell you, I don't think he liked that. Mm-hmm. he had to drink. Yeah, exactly. And also, Dr. Kunkel could talk more about the necrophiliac. But he would, there's a sign about people not saying that they're gentle, he would drug them first before he killed them. Other people enjoy killing them. But back to Jeffrey Dahmer, what pushed him to those acts that we're talking about is experimentation, the dead animals, asking his dad, and even though his dad thought, oh, you like my job, and how to take the flesh off bones and so on, and he was already experimenting in an area that he was really profoundly drawn to, or compulsed to, pushed to, and then when he was with his first victim, he panicked when the guy was trying to leave, and that's what pushed him, and he killed him. And then that started his pursuit to find that zombie lover that would never leave, and the experimentation he did with each of them. Not saying that's a healthy choice, right?
Probably don't advise.
But each offender that you look at make different choices. And what throws students off also in my class is I have to say, you have to think about the criminal. What were they thinking? And when you look at what they were thinking, they're just a logical, rational individual with emotions like we are, but they're trying to get to those goals in a different way. Love, sexuality, happiness, belonging, but they're doing it in very harmful ways.
Well, and I think that's a great point. I don't think people often think of it that way, that they're just a means to an end that is different than how it would be for you and I, but I think that speaks to your psychology and criminology background of knowing that, it's not like this person didn't just come out like a murderer at 2 years old.
It's a trajectory, kind of like you're being pushed. We think, but depending on what environment we are, we respond to it. Like, sure, at 2, well, Ted Bundy was caught putting knives in his aunt's bed, right? Something wrong with that kid.
Right, but it doesn't always present.
It doesn't mean he's going to end that way, right?
Exactly.
But, keep track of him.
Yeah. Just keep an eye out.
Exactly.
Hide your knives, maybe.
That's right. But the thing is that people are so fascinated with these organized killers that these killers, you could sit beside him. He was a good friend. He was great to talk to. Or they're so charming that women, dress up and go to court and try to bat their eyes at them and marry them. They just don't see the darkness, as you might call, or on some theorists they call it kind of a shadow that they switch back to deal with the building up of stress, as you might say, to make them strike out and kill, for them to cope with life in a sense. It's really about power and control. I'm losing power. I'm losing control over my life. Okay, I want to kill someone.
Yeah, I can control that.
Exactly.
I can take a hold of this and do this.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that I can follow up. I can follow through on, and I can feel something about it.
And feel better and get that immediate gratification. There's also
I did something.
Yeah, exactly. And I felt that, and that person is I have maybe conquered them or fulfilled some
they're
element.
no longer.
Yeah,
I'm here and they're not. Kind of.
Yeah, and it goes into how they interact with the victim to find out their motivations and what they're really looking for. Someone, you should talk to Dr. Kunkel more about the necrophile.
You will meet him soon.
Yeah. And that's really a person who can't deal with rejection. I'm sure there's many other subtypes, but dealing with a dead body safe, right? But as someone who enjoys torturing, the sadist component, that's a whole different story right there.
So those don't really fall necessarily.
No, it's a different means, but more like taste. It's still power. Mm-hmm. It's still control of a situation. It's easier to control a situation when someone's dead than someone who's alive. Yeah. But if they're alive, all the more feeling and rush of feeling God.
Yeah, exactly. You've got something to conquer, something to do.
Mm-hmm. And it depends on what you enjoy and doing with that on some level, even just molestation of a young child. I know pedophiles truly love the child, but there's still something about that power imbalance and not feeling comfortable with your peers that you try to seek yet again. The goal, love, was something very inappropriate.
Totally inappropriate.
But then there's other individuals that seek that relationship because of the power imbalance and the whole sadistic concept of it. So, there's so many ways that people, can endlessly talk about how people harm another, especially when we're talking about physically violent. There's also, we have the shootings in cities that are going up, and they're really just kids getting mad at each other. And it's fun. It is. And and I kind of wonder about that. Like, is this because they don't have that element way back in childhood to say, if you get angry, this is how you deal with it?
Yeah. Don't pick up a gun.
Yeah, it will get to that level, but they come back, you get me pissed off, so I'm going to come back and show you, don't do that to me. You insulted me. There's no respect here. Yeah.
I'm like the biggest person against fighting, and I hate, like, when I was in high school, people would be like, oh my gosh, look at this video of a fight. I'm like, no, I can't watch that. I'm so worried for that person's health. But I feel like even when I was growing up, like, that's what happened. People would fight. They wouldn't, you disrespected me, I disrespect you. We're going to fight. And then maybe, unfortunately, we'll bring other people into it, which that was scary enough when people would jump other people. And now it's like, nope, you disrespected me, I've got a gun. And it's like, whoa, this is, and I don't think that impact is realized on, either side. Obviously, we've got a victim, usually young, like we're talking about teenagers that are doing these kind of things. There's a young victim and there's a young offender. So it's like, do you even know what
sometimes
you just did?
Sometimes the victim is shooting back
at
the offender.
It's two offenders. But the way it ends, one life is lost and and another life is lost because now what? You know, your brain isn't even fully developed, and you've taken someone's life. You know, do you even understand the gravity of your decision? You know, I know.
But that's more impulsive though.
Yeah.
Guns are lethal. You know, I bet you anything if you had a choice, you know, getting dark here, right?
Oh,
If you had a choice, you would say, okay, I want you to kill this person. And I said, well, you have a choice. Either strangle them, be close up to them, or you're going to shoot them. You know, guns are lethal and clean. You know, but when you start getting to up close and personal,
safe
you can be safe. Oh, I see something moving there. You have a scope, boom. You don't see that, you know, that's a human, that's a person, right? So it's easier to just pull the trigger. So when you really got to look at gun violence in inner city areas and that's a component of that, and also the black market. Same thing like with the opiates, that we have problems with that there. Ease of access, the black market, ease of access has increased after the crack epidemic. So you have that component there. But for people who can get up close and personal, harm someone, it changes. See, there's many ways to kill someone, but it takes a different personality to do it in different ways.
Say like certain, you know, multiple or dozens of stab wounds, like, oh, that was something personal. Strangling someone, like, it was personal. Usually just going in, you know, I've watched enough crime shows where they say, okay, we can tell this wasn't a random attack, or it's very unlikely that it was a random attack because there's some passion, there's something behind this. This person was able to, or even sometimes like when they cover the victim's face, they've, you know, on the opposite side of the spectrum, like, I feel bad that I did this, or I can't look at what I've done after the fact. I feel like that speaks to like what you were saying, that panic mode of maybe they didn't mean to kill them, or they didn't want to kill them.
Well, the covering of the face, though, we're kind of getting all over topic. But as long as you're okay, but we can talk about it though.
Yeah.
The covering of the face, as some authors have called out, like undoing, and that's not. Some cases it could be panic. Other cases is that many of these people who are sadistic is they see people as objects, right? The chair you're sitting on, they're a toy, right? That's a whole different type of killer too, right? Okay, so but you're an object. But some people, right, when they kill, they don't like the face. They're like, whoa, that makes me remember this is a person, right? So they cover it, so they continue what they're doing. So it's not really a mode of panic, the covering the face. Other people might do it. You know, it changes, but in general, if you see the face covered, but the level of depravity, you know, covering the face of a person so you continue doing what you're doing,
like,
as opposed to the face not bothering you. You know,
exactly.
is it worse that you actually make the intentional step to say, I can't continue, just cover that face, right? You know, and then I can keep going.
Yeah, that's even more of a, like, disrespect to the person.
It
like,
is.
now you don't have a face, and now I'm just using what I want.
Exactly, and some of them, they use underwear, you know, and I think that's worse.
Yeah.
You know, that's even more degrading you know. You know, or other ones just, I don't know how far and dark you want me to get here.
I mean, we are free and open. So.
I know, you know, but some of them will smash the face in with their hands. The face is very fragile, and the face is obliterated, you know.
And that speaks to even.
That's just anger at the humanity of the individual, and then you move on and rape them if they did it in their order, right? So, you know, when you talk anger, you can see anger, like we just said. You know, the smash in the face, that's a lot of anger, you know.
And that takes some, like, strength. Like, it's got to have that anger strength behind it.
And the strength, too. Like, if someone strangles someone, that could take 4 to 8 minutes. If it's a child, sure, less, 2 minutes, and depending on the strength of the individual. But can you really hold the throat for 8 minutes?
But there's been, I'll just speak vaguely because that made me think of it. There's been a case in the news where one teenager supposedly strangled another teenager. And my first thought was exactly what you just said. How could a child strangle another child? Like, it's not just that quick. Like, it's not just I'm squeezing your neck and you're dead. Like, it takes some time.
It's a lot of anger, and the more that it's a child, I think that would fuel the emotion
the anger
more.
Gets out of control easier.
The hormones, the anger. Like, I'm sure you've seen little kids, you know, they get pissed
and
off.
They throw stuff.
They throw stuff, or they smash the kid, or they take that toy and just like boom on the head. Give me that, right? You know, it's a real. They can get
primal.
Yeah, exactly. It's a primitive emotion, you know. And then you tell them, no, don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
My son was,
We have to calm down.
yeah, my
Take
son
deep
was a
breath.
biter, right? And I'm like, oh my God,
What am I gonna do?
Everybody's mad at me because my son bites people, not uses words, right? but when children, the child homicides, and like I said again, Dr. Kunkel too, he can add to this, is that some of them just kill, which is interesting because they're curious. What's it like to kill someone? And they just do it.
See, that terrifies me. That sends chills through my bones. Everything that we've been talking about, I'm like, yeah, yeah. But that is for me, that's the scariest motive because it's you want to know what that feels like? Why?
Yeah.
What in you? What do you think it's gonna feel like? Do you think it's gonna be satisfying? Do you, that's scary.
Exactly. But many people, you won't know if something's going to happen to you, right? Either raging for a heart attack or someone hurting you. But really, when you talk about the statistics, you are more likely to catch schizophrenia, which hits only 1% of the population, versus a madman coming to your house and killing you. Yeah. So you got to put it in perspective. Because when you're talking about this, there's a funny line I still remember me saying in undergrad. I don't want to study criminology, I said. I still remember to my friend, I'd be too scared walking around.
And here you are.
And here I am talking about it, and I'm censoring myself right now.
Too dark?
Yeah, I could get darker, but I don't want to.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, and it's just, and other people might get really offended with me talking about what a person can do to harm one, but you have to understand why people do it to actually seek justice. Right. To get a better understanding of which direction can we go with this, and try to find out who did this crime and what you can do to prevent yourself from getting harmed.
Like we spoke about, and I've spoken about with Chris before, it's that there's the treatment aspect of it.
Yeah.
It's hard to treat someone, incarcerated or not, whether if you don't know what's the problem, what's making them tick, what's making them deviate from societal norms. You can't fix the problem without finding the problem.
Yeah, you got to understand it, and what led them to make these choices. And in treatment, there is a point that they say this person needs to be locked up for life. Yeah. And they have civil confinement here in New York State, which is great. This person's going to reoffend. He's been killing people or raping people, for most of their life. You let them go, they will reoffend. But then you look at their prison record, they're honorable individuals, model inmates, right? Merit release. And you're like, no.
That's they can function in that structure.
Well, they can function, but it's also when you look at this element of criminal, they know their main goal is to get out. Mm-hmm. So they can be merit no problem, right? And then they're released. They can do something wrong. Yeah. And
nobody's watching over my shoulder now.
Exactly. And you have that compulsion, that drive. It's not necessarily, some of them say, I don't want to. Like, here's an element in Canada. I was in a healing circle observing, and a healing circle is when people talk, and there were inmates talking. And this one man stood up and he said, I'm here again. He said, my whole life I get released and I get incarcerated again. And he says, it's my anger. I cannot control my anger, no matter how hard he tried. He said, I just go there in a public setting and I end up hurting someone because I get so angry. And you see him, and he looks like an individual that feels bad about it, but he can't control. So that's where, Chris would come in and say, okay, let's see what we can do about that. But we don't have that in our prisons. They talk about releasing people, but why don't they actually invest in prisons, provide the proper treatment, proper individual assessment, as opposed to putting people in groups and painting everyone with a broad brush? It's tough, understanding the whys and how to really approach a cure, as opposed to, I know some advocates might be mad with me saying this, releasing someone, and that person is released because he's young, but he just kicked down a 75-year-old woman and continued kicking when she was down. What kind of person is that? Why would you release them? That shows the propensity.
I think that's where you really have to look at a case-by-case basis. That, like you said, that was a great way to put it, but you can't just paint everyone with a broad brush, because each individual is different. Each individual case and background and reasoning and
The justice system has to be providing equity and not biased. So that's why they try
It's
to
like,
come
yep,
in.
everybody that fits this box goes this way, and everybody that's in this one goes this way.
Exactly.
And then we're done.
And you can't change the
fair.
sentence too much. So everybody's treated fairly, but each person's an individual in what they do. And when you get a person who can, has, cross situational inconsistency, like they can adapt back and forth depending who's watching them, that's a dangerous individual. And they can fool anyone. They could fool the most trained person, like, oh, that guy was great,
That's
but they're not.
kind of down like the sociopath.
Psychopaths is very different scenario. They say treatment or treatment communities. You put a psychopath in there, you just teach them how to be a better psychopath and what to say to manipulate people better. Yeah, so it's a pretty convoluted area. And how would you respond to the psychopath and what kind of psychopath it is? And that's why we have civil confinement, is to find those people that are very basically born that way, but went down the path of harming people. There's lots of psychopaths out there, right?
They just do different things with their time.
They're harmful. They're good business people,
Yeah, it's funny because they often do seem to present a lot of like positive traits in the sense of like you said, business management. Like it can be positive because of the compartmentalized brain, but then if you use it for negative, it is like horror.
Yeah, it can go there because they lack the emotional depth, and they're able to do that to get that thrill from life. They're always thrill-seeking individuals, and it is tough because the normal psychopath. I can't say
the normal psychopath.
The normal ones.
There's the quote.
Yes, serial killers are the abnormal psychopath. They are, right? But the psychopaths are running around and they pretend I'm a therapist, and they can make you believe they're a therapist and sit across from you. And you're like, oh, that's a good therapist, right?
But go kill someone tomorrow.
Well, they won't kill, but they're feeding off you telling them about their life, and they're sitting there like, oh, I'm not even a therapist, right? And they get off on that. There was also one story, and he said there's one guy, and he made people in the hospital believe he was a surgeon, went into an OR and operated.
Oh my
and then he ran away.
Oh my God. Just to see if he could do it?
See if he could do it. The thrill, and the idea of like, they are there, all these trained people, and gave me a scalpel. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
Or they con you, out of money, or like, I have some nice, the saying with swampland in Florida for you.
Yeah.
Right? That's a psychopath, right? They're just going around trying to feel something from life. It does harm people. Yes. Okay. But they're not harming to what we know that hits the headlines. Right. And they can go to that level. It is thrilling cheating people, right? Being that white collar criminal, stealing money and not feeling anything, or being that top level businessman, same thing. It's power, right? But then you have the same thing of that interpersonal violence. That's also a thrill to have someone's life in your hands and do whatever you want and not get caught. Because you know how some serial killers go as far as taunting police, writing letters and that.
Letters, yes.
Yeah, and they never caught like the Zodiac and all them. That's just part of the play. It's the game. They are smart. They're sophisticated. But when you read their court transcripts, it's kind of like they ask you a question like, did you know this person? No, I did not. And they said, did you know she lived in Colony? No. He said, no, I did not. And he goes, I didn't know she lived in Colony. Or here's another question you would give him. Have you ever had this hunting knife? No, but I had other hunting knives. It's kind of like,
okay, so.
Yeah, they talk in that circular kind of like, or did I? Yeah. And that's the game, right? And that game is sophisticated because they have trained themselves throughout life and how to get what they want. Playing with people and getting what you want, right? And it is very exhausting and difficult. And I'm sure, Dr. Kunkel could elaborate on that. Not very many people are trained to know how to talk to these people. And there is some studies that are done, criminals that are somewhat psychopathic or more have a criminal personality, you have to be straight with them. Like I was in a prison with students taking them on a tour. And one inmate went up to the corrections officer and said, how are you? And the correction officer turned around and goes, what do you want? Like, imagine saying that to anybody every day on the street like that. But he said that because if he started answering how he was, it's an in. Do you get that? And that's the next step to manipulation. Or the poor woman in Clinton, how she was manipulated by the two people that escaped. It's the same thing. Manipulate to get what they want. She thought they loved her, right? And everything, they knew everything what they say. They found that she was vulnerable, and they got what they wanted. It's the same thing. These are master manipulators and fun people to talk to. I know one person that he was interviewing people in prison, and he said, I got along great with this one guy. And he's the one guy I never looked back on him in his file. He was a contract killer. He killed people for business, and he said he was great to talk to. And it's just,
they could just turn that on.
You won't know. You won't talk to them and go, oh, you're weird, right? The weird ones might be the safe ones, right?
Yeah, right? Those are the ones that's like the red herring of the group.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a weirdo. Stay away. It's the person.
It's the person you're buddy up with.
Yeah.
Would not be a good friend, right? But fun to be around, talk to. Yeah.
That leads me to something I remember you saying a while back. I was actually thinking about it today. We have known each other for over a year now. Congratulations!
Oh, wow, congratulations!
Yeah. So something I remember you said, I think, at our first time meeting was you had to kind of steer your students away from this idea that every case you look at or every unresolved case it was a serial killer. It's always a serial killer. Like you said, most times it's really not.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about why it's not usually a serial killer?
Sure. So when you look at a case, and especially when you look at the really depraved cases, right? Blood, the interpersonal, strangulation, rape, so on, right? You always go down the line. He goes, okay, let's look in the area. And then, when you look at unresolved cases way back and even to today, there is a serial killer around the corner. Even though we don't have many, they're active, especially when you look historically, over the decades. And you got to push them away because, as I said, you're more likely to get schizophrenia than be attacked by a serial killer. So you have to. That's the good kind of way to do your checklist. Okay, he looks good, but let's push him away. Okay, let's talk about, Ruth Whitman with Colony Police.
Yes.
So that is out there. We've talked about it already. So, when we worked on that case, hopefully they're getting close to the DNA comparison swabs for the exhumation right now. But Robert Garrow kept coming up. We push him away. Okay, he's a serial rapist and killer, over the decades. We'd push him away, and then he'd come back. Oh, he was seen at the fire where the victim was last seen. I'm like, no, push him away. So when they keep coming into the picture, he started to become more of a viable suspect, right? But the people in general that are more likely to harm you are people who love you, your friends, or maybe a drug addict. A simple kind of scenario. One police officer, when I was sitting there, he goes, I get it. He said, when it comes to homicides, when it's somebody, like I've mentioned on the list. But then he says, when someone just kills and there's no connection to that individual, I don't get it. They just don't understand it. Just for, it's a game, the thrill, the zest
door
to feel.
was open, they walked by at the right time.
Well, not even the door was open. Someone would justify, goes, well, they left the door unlocked, so that made me go in. That they deserve me to come in and kill them, right? Or they left the door unlocked. That's how they make better. They deserved it. I taught them a lesson, right? Especially the ones that got away. You have those elements. So you can't look at the serial killers. They're the less likely. They're the ones who are more organized. Possible, yeah. But we can't look at them seriously. And in most cases, I'm thinking about cases right now.
Which ones can we talk about?
Yeah, not only those, but in generality, most cases, they are people that you know. When it's truly serial, it's dark. And I can say the dark would be for people to understand. It would be presented like Jack the Ripper cases, which are...
This is Still Searching.